I'm not sure why they would expect it to be here. Now, we'll talk a bit about the government. And I argue here that most people have no idea how the government works, and that includes many people who are actually in the government. But they don't understand the system, lack of critical thinking, and this compared to what is one of the things I come back to. An audience like this believes that UFOs are terribly important. To the general population, that is not true. Most people believe in UFOs, but it makes to the, so what, compared, we'll watch the movies and things like that. So it's not a great difference to most of the people. Now, large institutions, first of all, they exist to serve themselves. And you look at the top priorities there. Retaining power is number one. The golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules. They're going to control that, and it requires basic logic. And the emphasis always is on short-term objectives. You watch that going on in the polls that are going on right now. Another thing I want to point out, the bottom one, the government does not have a department of good ideas, things to do it, and yet we seem to think that this is going to go into, some form. So if you don't have a department of good ideas, it's got to fall into one of the existing things. This is another incongruous statement. The public generally believes the government overall is basically incompetent, except in one field, and that's UFOs, and they're omniscient there. They can control absolutely everything there, but can't get the mail, certainly not healthcare and things of that nature. This is kind of interesting because you notice when Snowden came out, and you go, hey, he released the stuff on PRISM, and they were really concerned. Let's say, UFOs versus PRISM and that, hard to believe. Now I get into ergofusion, which I say is the misidentification of causal relationship. If A, therefore B, not necessarily. We also have a lot of them where technology causes bad behavior. We always hear about the slippery slopes. I'll argue all slopes are slippery. And those are not great ideas on why we ought to be controlling. Now here are some examples, of misidentification is, if you have UFOs, therefore Pandora exists. Probably from the movie. If the UFO or the government asks a question, does that mean we have spies involved in it? Ergofusion, you have an individual request. I'll talk to that one a bit more. Woolsey asked CIA to look at it. Individual interests. This is really kind of an important point. The huge difference between individual interest and institutional responsibility. We have people throughout the government who have, independent belief systems. They have interest in a wide range of area. That does not necessarily translate to, therefore, the agency that they're involved in is going to have interest in the area or responsibility as well. We'll talk about old documents in just a minute. This is one the CIA actually did a study. You had Jim Woolsey, who was at one point the director, and he says, what do we know about UFOs? And he had a guy, a historian from NRO, National Reconnaissance Organization, and they went out and looked. And again, the answer was, well, it was one thing, he actually found a memo. This was kind of interesting, that I think is important. CIA found a memo that said, oh, we're part of a group for a quick response. And oh, by the way, that group has never met. So again, tells you something about the level of priority. And the report that we came up with said very little new. Ended up saying, like the JFK conspiracies, no matter what we say, this issue is not going to go away. Another thing, I love you guys. I mean, Stan Friedman is a good friend. He's a great researcher, but he constantly, holds up these things. And you see these documents. Most of them are at least 50 years old. And you go, where's the new stuff that we keep talking about? Now, conversely and importantly, who does believe in UFOs? Well, it turns out some pretty important people do and would disagree with me. Ed Mitchell's a personal friend. We discussed this many times, been on boards together, and we come to different conclusions. But you have John Podesta with God. You had many senior officials from the French who actually put out a document saying the the government is hiding it, and about 70% of the population of the US believes that the government is withholding information. One of the things they keep talking about doing is, let's have congressional hearing. And you go, why do you want to do that? Now, everybody thinks in terms of, the Kennedy assassination hearings and all of this. I picked a particular day, I was giving this before, and it was 5 February of 14. That day, the Senate held 4 hearings, the House had 17 hearings, and if you look at the productivity of Congress, you go, eh. So I do not understand why people are so bent on having hearings. It really means that people get together and put some things on record in about half a day, but you're not going to get to the bottom of anything there. Now, how important is this to the American people? I compare this to, let's look at the biggest conference we have here, about 1,000 people, maybe 1,200. Here's Comic-Con. 130,000 people and they sell out. Really, and they said, if you think UFO crowd is weird, you want to attend Comic-Con. I looked through the biggest one was 4 million people. This is in India, a recording artist I had never heard of. But there are many concerts here with over 1 million people. Yet getting 1,000 is unusual. I mentioned this was last month. I was in Nasik, India, went into the Godavari River. There's a Hindu ceremony that's held, Kumbh Mela, which is held every 12 years. There's a convergence and the sadhus come together. Had my sins washed away in the river here. Said I'm looking for some new sins now, but the point here, there were in that day in the river, there were 4 million people. There were 40 million attending this whole thing. So that is when you say globally, what's an important issue, that's getting up there. The biggest UFO conference, actually it was Elijah Muhammad had it, had 17,000 people to talk about him in Chicago. Now, one of the things that you read all the time that the others are here. I say, okay, well, if they're here, it's certainly not for our benefit, and this is who they came in with, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you look at epidemics, poverty around the world is certainly getting worse, so ET is not helping us there. Same thing with food shortages around the world. If they're helping us in, the conflicts that are ongoing, certainly not helpful. And this is a huge compared to what? I use this number on every presentation that I give. At some time today, because these numbers are whirling down here, this is the national debt as of some point today. So when you talk about what you want the government to do, and you compare it to war, problems of the middle class, or the planetary survival, and healthcare, what is it you want our leadership to be focused on? I also talk from a military perspective because they seem to think it ought to be in the military. This is, I think, something that's not recognized. This Ranger is returning home from his 14th combat tour. A bunch of people here don't realize that we now have people who have been in combat more than 3 times as long as anybody in World War II. The point here is, where do you think UFOs fit on the DoD priority list? Again, we don't expect the U.S. government to be involved in religion, and yet we have, all of these major religions with phenomena associated with it. The Apollo program is really kind of interesting. I know a number of them, but I think it's worth looking at. Apollo was about a lot more than going to the moon. Apollo was designed to establish Americans' technological dominance in the world. At that point, 4%, I'll get to it in a minute, but the amount of money, 4% of the government budget was associated to NASA. These are some of the Apollo astronauts that I know personally and have been associated with. And they all said no. Even Ed Mitchell, who seems to think there is a cover-up in that, is very clear when he says nothing that he learned from NASA has anything to do with UFOs. Also, when you look at, if you remember when we first sent men to the moon, 11 and 12, what happened when they came back? Anybody who's old enough to remember, they went into isolation. And we were worried about what would happen with just microbes affecting people. It was after a while we said, no, there's no microbe contamination. But there are stories out there that says you want to believe that Eisenhower was allowed to go on board and communicate with them. The point here is that we have, if we had the slightest participation, I might mention, Helen Kupperman was a friend of mine, who Bob, who was the director of FEMA, and she was a lawyer for NASA, and says, we did not forget about this. We had many discussions and actually came up with protocols and said, it called for, if ET, it would be automatic worldwide release. There's treaties that suggest that as well. And there were no contingency plans. And Roswell, Holy of Holies, and this is one that inevitably gets me in trouble, particularly here in New Mexico, because I come down against Roswell, and I am absolutely convinced that something happened at Roswell, no doubt about that. Was it ET or not? Again, I come down, no. I will say, I have very high-level, influential friends who totally disagree with me on this point. What I deal with is my first-hand evidence, and my first-hand evidence says no, that what you had many witnesses, a few of them are credible. When you start studying it, the facts never all fit. Now, Roswell is one, I don't care how you study it, this twain never fits neatly in a package. But another thing, Roswell was not a big deal. Yeah, there were headlines when it first came out in '47, but then it really died off until Bill Moore came along in 1980. Said Roswell was real, but I think we can talk to it. Actually, Bill Burns, who was a co-author with Phil Corso, wrote to it, and they brought a couple of guys in. I am really convinced. I think that Jesse Jr. and Sr. absolutely straightforward. One of the things I like Jesse Jr. is he said exactly what he knew and nothing more. Too many people in this field just kind of embellish. He says, my experience was 15 minutes, in 1947, that's the extent of it. But a number of thin film materials were laid out and said, do you see the material that you saw then, or a similar material? And there were two witnesses we believed had their hands on it, and they go, that's it. And said it was metallized mylar, and it was available in that time, and there's a pretty good reason for why it would have gone long. By the way, the Air Force did an absolutely abysmal job in their reporting on this. So, in my view, we have a logic problem when you get into the political aspects of it. You got politicians who are in competition for the most powerful position in the world. These guys would sell their mothers. And yet, even though they had access to the information, this is the one secret that they don't use. And I argue this would be the quintessential October surprise. You release information about this just before a major election. This was Story and I were being inducted into the Hall of Fame and the Smithsonian there. Story is one, and I've included him in the book as well. As you know, he's an astronaut, probably more time than anybody else in space. Just said, if I ever find information of it, I will release it. And he has been involved in the secret crashes. Now, I argue if all of these crashes happen, as everybody claimed, ET has a quality control problem. They don't even understand, basic crashes that technology that we have on cars today, much less that you have in space. You find out there, I had found one site listing 38 crashes, 122 bodies, and 14 live ETs. They don't do very well. Now we have a lot of self-inflicted wounds. We'll talk to Phil Corso, the book Area 51. Most of the stuff is demonstrably false. Doesn't stop us talking about it. Phil Corso was a friend of mine. He's a really great guy. Problem was, now he was who he said he was. He served where he said he did. But when we went in and checked, we knew about Phil before the book came out. I was at the National Institute of Discovery Science at the time, and that's where we met him before. That's Al Putoff, some of you know George Knapp, and Phil. And the problem is when you started checking out particularly the stuff on the technology, the technology advances, in kind of a straight line. You don't see it go along in any place where it makes a big jump. Turns out the director of Night Vision Lab was a personal friend of mine, the guy who actually built the laboratory. And he was open to weird stuff. I actually had metal bending parties in his lab. Worst one they've ever done, wouldn't do it again, but the guy was open to it. So I asked him about the history because, they talked about alien eyeballs and all that. Just not there. The technology developed, and they say they did not have ET. Now, unfortunately, I wrote a letter, in fact, in the back of the book, on the annex, there's a 7-page letter, single things like, Phil, it's Delphi, Maryland, not Adelphia, kind of mild to no, the Cold War was not a cover for fighting ET. And we met, and he had had a heart attack. Son was getting married. I was down in Florida. We went up and spent the day with him, and he said, yeah, I need to write a new book too, and he was working on it. He showed me the work. Phil was not computer literate, a lot of handwritten material. So he was working on making the changes, and unfortunately 10 days later had a second massive heart attack and died, so that went on. Now you had this guy, Chase Brandon, who made a big splash and then suddenly disappeared. He was CIA, and he said that he had seen this box of documents, unclassified, but in the vault there at the thing. I filed a FOIA, and finally it took them 2 years to get an answer and say, we have no such file. More interesting, I have a very senior friend who has just retired from the agency, very, very senior, interested in the topic, and he too went in and said, where is this stuff? We're hearing about it, and got the same answer that I did much more quickly. So you had this big splash, just wasn't there. Area 51, tragic book. The Roadrunners, who were actual pilots from the area, thought they were going to finally get their story out. And what happened was that you had this Al O'Donnell told the story. Now you have other stories that come out from people who unfortunately really are in some of the positions that they say they are, but the story just doesn't hang together. This was, you'll find this one on there, this anonymous source, talks about Eisenhower is the captain. Eisenhower, who is the president, comes to see him and tells them that they're going to invade, the Third Army invade Area 51. I mean, just total nonsense stuff that doesn't hold up. Stephen Greer stuff, it was interesting. I know the people did the research on it and said, no, that it is human, severely deformed human, but DNA said it came from a female in the Yakima Desert region in Chile, exactly where it was fine. And you'll find on all of his missives that go out and send me money. And my point here is that deformity is more common than you might accept. Here's an example of a baby that's not an alien in Venezuela. Here are some other examples. The point is that the range of human deformity is pretty significant. Snowden put out reports of Snowden putting out things that said NSA documents said that we have the tall whites, that we got them from Hitler, and they had been driving our foreign policy. That I thought was kind of interesting. This showed up among things in an Israeli paper. This is a guy I have debated. You've probably heard him in some place. What's concern to me is the guy really was the Minister of Defense in Canada, and he's one who's put out that the nasty American DOD wants to fight with ET and we have an ongoing war. He also told me to believe every word of Corso, and we were at a conference and I said, well, you know, who are your sources that are telling you this? And he goes, how did you ever get to be a colonel if you're asking a minister what his sources are? Well, okay. But the point was that, you know, he said he's claiming that we're at war, that many planes have been destroyed, and you just don't find that. They got 4 species, and it gets pretty dramatic, the information. So if ET is in fact driving our foreign policy, you got to thank him, because this is what has brought us. You know, Korea, Somalia, etc. They haven't done a very good job of driving our foreign policy, if that's it. Are there real cover-ups? Absolutely. There are some that are intentional, but one of the common factors about all the cover-ups is they eventually get discovered. But this is one that bothers me, because this guy is the head of MUFON in Pennsylvania. Goes on, this member of the Malaysian aircraft went down. He is on national television telling people that a UFO swooped in and absconded with the aircraft. I'm sorry, but I think that this stuff really does great damage to the credibility of investigations. Another problem you had, this is one of Greer's key guys who, you know, just absolutely was bogus. He had about as much credibility. He was supposed to be a general, but the most credibility is Colonel Sanders. And these things contaminate all the others. Anybody interested, I can talk about any of these cases. There was a case, I'm a member of the SSE, Society for Scientific Exploration, and we're quite open-minded. But we had one of the key people in 2012 gave a presentation, and this is based on a photo from Mars. And there's a thing right here that he says is a spray that's being put out. And doing remote viewing, they claimed that they saw that we had a DOD base was up there, underground base in there, and this stuff was spraying out, and there were inhabitants, there were human, and part of a black military operation. And one of the quotes was, you know, flights slip out of Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy all the time. You say, no, I live in Florida, you know, every time you have a launch, half of Florida lights up. So there aren't people slipping out to Mars. There's lots of stuff on Mars. I throw this one out if any of you know Boylan. You probably don't know as I'm not me, because I was killed a number of years ago, and then he had to explain how I showed up, and I was replaced, and all of this. The point was that you know he volunteers to be the spokesperson for Earth. You know, he's going to be the ambassador and all that. And my point is, when you get into these things, there really are no lower limits. I don't care how bad a story you make up, folks are going to believe it. And I may be on some folks' toes here as well. MJ-12 is kind of interesting. I happen to believe MJ-12 existed. There are people who think that I was the head of it. If anybody's aware of that, I wish they'd send the paycheck, because I've been missing that one all along. But you know, there are people who come out there. There was a report, and I was told quite confidentially that, yep, this existed. This is the right set of people. If I looked at it carefully, I could figure out what it was. And I think we do know that it really was the forerunner to a very classified program that had to do with it was called COG, Continuity of Government, designed to keep the world safe after potential nuclear decapitation. Who are they? Of course, it's somebody you don't know. It's the various secret organizations that run the world. I have worked with the Council on Foreign Relations, and that anybody who thinks that these people are monolithic in their thought just don't understand people and how they get along. They fight internally and think that they get together and decide what's right for the world and how they're going to divide it up. Just really don't understand human psychology. Don't believe that there's any huge black programs out there. I mentioned NASA before. When we went to the moon, it was 4% of the national budget. Right now, we're down, an order of magnitude, about 0.46. If you look at who's doing what, I mean, we've now got to rely on civilian. We have civilian innovation of space, but don't have any anti-gravity devices. I had one in here that said, who's driving this train? It's a few rich guys. This is ex-boss Bob Bigelow. No, that's actually Burt Rutan putting the space up. Branson owns that now. Bob Bigelow in space. We've ceded space, in my view, to China. So you don't have